The assassination of the late Dr. Martin Luther King. He is here tonight. We're going to honor him. We're going to hear from him. Please, ladies and gentlemen, rise and show your love to Mr. DeArmie Bailey.
Thank you very much, Brother Glenn. I want to give my special thanks and appreciation to Representative Vanessa Lowry Brown for her leadership in organizing this weekend and especially in the graciousness of you and your staff and your supporters to me and my visit here to your great city. I was honored yesterday to be at City Hall and to be present as your Mayor Nutter read his proclamation. And I'm really honored to be a part of this event as you honor the great leader Sonia Sanchez and the President Mandazar of the NAACP for his important work in our community. And I'm humbled by your recognition of some of my work in civil rights. I read a book once about Martin Luther King that was called Martin Luther King Jr., The Inconvenient Hero. And it was written by Professor Vincent Harding, who is at the Elif School of Theology in Denver. And Professor Harding was a friend of Dr. King's. And the title of the book reflects on an observation that it's more convenient to make heroes of those who are dead because we can reconstruct our images of them than recognize who they were in their lives. And we have frozen, this is Dr. Harding's assessment, the image of Dr. King to the I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington in 1963. But we failed to recognize that in the 5 years between 1963 and 1968, when Dr. King was killed in Memphis, his message had changed because he recognized that in addition to the struggle against racism in America, there was a much deeper struggle against the wealth gap and against the poverty that was so pervasive across this country. And we know that at the time that Dr. King was killed, he had shifted his focus to the economic struggle. And he had begun to understand that we needed fundamental structural change in America, not simply moderate reform and recognition of dreams, but changing the systems of power and institutional authority in this country from top to bottom. I was blessed to grow up in the South. I was born in Memphis. And when I was born and growing up in Memphis, Tennessee, the city was segregated in the 1940s and the 1950s. The public schools, I went to an all-black school, Booker T. Washington. The public facilities were segregated. We couldn't go to the amusement park except on Tuesdays. And if Tuesday was a holiday, we couldn't go that week. We'd have to wait till the next week so the whites could go to the park. And if we were going to the zoo, it'd be on Thursday, except if it was a holiday, we'd have to wait. If we went to the movie theater, we'd have to climb all the way up to the balcony. And of course, we sat in the backs of the bus. And yet, nevertheless, in spite of that institutionalized racism that we were growing up in, it didn't capture our minds and imprison our souls so that we became believers in second-class personhood that was attempted to be imposed upon us by the institution of white authority in our communities. And so I grew up in a community where black people were proud. We opened class. I went to kindergarten school. And we opened class every morning singing the Negro National Anthem. Now I have to admit, Brother Glenn, I do have some trouble with the lyrics. And I left Memphis as a high school student. And I went down to Southern University, the largest all-black university in the country, 5,000 students in Baton Rouge. And I went down there because my brother was ahead of me, and he'd gone a year ahead for Memphis as a football player. Southern had a great football team. And I thought that I'd go down to Louisiana instead of going to Tennessee State, where most of my contemporaries were going. And Southern had some of the most beautiful women in the colleges, so I thought I was going to have a wonderful time. But I didn't know, as a 17-year-old, leaving Memphis and going to Baton Rouge, that I was stepping off into the middle of a revolution. Because it was in my freshman year at Southern that those 4 students at North Carolina A&T sat at that lunch counter in February of 1960.
Yeah.
And the witness of those students and the courage of those students spread like wildfire to black college campuses across the South, at Jackson State and Alabama State, and at Southern. So some of my students were arrested, my fellow students. And we protested. And we lost, at least for the moment, that fight. We didn't get the change immediately that we were seeking. The president of the university and the administration quelled the protest. Why? Because it was a state university, and if they didn't put a stop to the protest, then they would lose their own positions. And so they stopped our movement when I was in my freshman year. But I saw the spirit of young people rising up. And so 2 years later, the protest started again in Louisiana in 1961. And some students went down and were arrested. And then again, we from the campus marched by the hundreds, 3,000 of us from Scotlandville, where Southern is, to downtown Baton Rouge. And we marched to the jailhouse, where the students were, 18 of them in jail on the second floor. And it was a cold, rainy day, and we stood out there. And we were dressed in our finest, the students, orderly, listening to the protest. And then some of our students who were in jail began to sing from the second floor. And then one of our leaders who was speaking to us suggested that when we finished the rally, we could go and sit in ourselves at some of the segregated restaurants in downtown Baton Rouge. And I write about that experience in my book, The Education of a Black Radical. It is impossible to describe what it feels like to be shot with tear gas. I could say it makes your skin sting and burn so badly, you think it is peeling off your hands and face. I could say it makes your eyes feel as if they have been set on fire, and then it makes your eyes water so steadily you cannot see. I could say that when the harsh, pungent gas fills your lungs, it is as if 2 great hands have reached up and squeezed your diaphragm and then placed a large bag over your head so you cannot breathe. But these descriptions, while accurate, don't convey the full effect of the experience. Even more difficult to explain is that the anger I felt that December afternoon as the tear gas canisters exploded throughout the streets of downtown Baton Rouge. It was of an intensity I had never before known. All the hellish years, all the indignity and injuries and injustice, all the times a white person had refused to acknowledge me, all the times I had been insulted welled up inside of me. All those feelings and memories broke through the walls of restraint I had built around them and came together in one hard mass of anger. And some part of me said no more. Some part of me said I will not live my life in the back alleyways of the world. And I hardened myself to the fact that though my purpose was good, if I stood by it, anything could happen. The instant Sheriff Clemens hollered, "Move him out," one of the deputies threw a tear gas canister that struck Reverend Cox on the ankle. As it exploded, knocking him to the ground.
As several students rushed to carry Cox to safety, canisters exploded in quick succession up and down St. Louis Street. Confused and hysterical, we all began running, blindly trying to escape the swirling gas. Shoes, umbrellas, and purses littered the streets. I could hear the unmistakable barking of police dogs and the whirling of the sirens mixing with the almost overwhelming noise of students' screams, scattered singing, and the sharp explosions of the tear gas canisters. Of course, there was nothing to do but run. To run as fast as you could and to try not to wipe your eyes, because as I found out later, that made it worse. And as I ducked down the nearest alley, I reminded myself that I had known that this was a possibility before I had agreed to come. I reminded myself that the police could and would do anything and would get away with it. I tried to convince myself that I had known and expected these things, but I hadn't. Not really. I hadn't expected or known that I would be so afraid. I hadn't known about the dogs or about not being able to breathe. I hadn't known what it would feel like to wonder as I ran with the police at my back if they might use those shotguns and if the bullets might hit me. But I ran anyway. I ran down alleys and tried to catch my breath in the doorways of buildings when a cloud of gas overwhelmed me. I closed my eyes and groped my way along the nearest wall. I ran looking for safety and fresh air. And I felt that though I might eventually find some air to breathe, I would never be safe anywhere. I hated that feeling, but I hated the white police more. Yeah. We continued our protest in Southern. Some students were kept in jail for weeks. Others, like myself, were expelled from the university. And I went on to finish school in Massachusetts at Clark University in Worcester. And that I had the opportunity, therefore, to move from the deep south to the north. And I got up to this campus, and I was one of 2 black students on the campus of Clark. And I was this great hero from the south that they wanted to talk to about what was going on in the south. And I looked around in the city of Worcester, Massachusetts, and I saw that they had a department store downtown with no black clerks. And they had a factory of 2,000 employees, 18 blacks, all janitors. And so I decided that let me stop talking about what's happening in the South. Let me talk about what's happening in Worcester, Massachusetts. And we picketed and we closed the plant. And we made them open the way. We filed complaints. And part of this story is to say to you that ours is a multifaceted struggle. It's a struggle not just through voter registration and voting and politics, taken to the streets, but we also filed complaints with the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. And this plant was a big defense contractor, so we filed a complaint with the U.S. Department of Defense, which launched an investigation that made this plant change. And so as you pick these targets, you must pick their many vulnerabilities. Brother Muhammad, one of the things I did while I was in Worcester was to invite Malcolm X to come to the campus to speak. And I had the privilege of meeting that great man as I met him at about 7 o'clock one morning when he arrived in town. And I spent the day with him, and I went with him to sit with newspaper editors at the Worcester Telegram and Gazette. And I sat with him at a radio station in Worcester as we went through an interview. And then I went with him over to the campus for his speech. I write about that too in the book. As Malcolm and I headed down the aisle of the school auditorium, he turned to me. Now you tell people that it wasn't my fault that we're late. I was here on time. It's your all's fault that you didn't get me here to this program when you were supposed to. Well, I had taken him to dinner with some of my supporters. I promised him that I would take the blame in my introduction, and I did. Then Malcolm stepped to the podium. There is no sufficient way to describe his captivating energy, no way to describe how I felt, sitting just feet from him as he spoke with his rare and riveting eloquence. I hoped selfishly that some part of that energy might bounce around the room and come back through me. I hoped I might suddenly discover what made him so strong. Malcolm's speech was a cry for the liberation of Negro America. From the moment he opened his mouth, he was completely transformed. The cloak of reserve he wrapped around himself throughout the day vanished as he became fiery and unrelenting. His voice carried all the threat, the intimidation, and the anger that had given him throughout white America his nightmarish reputation. Yet, the largely white audience sat in their seats as if hypnotized while he spoke in no uncertain terms about the contradictions of American society, about the degradation and destruction Negroes had experienced, and about the cruel exploitative traditions of white America. The crowd seemed not to move or even breathe, but to hang on to his every word. I noticed members of the black Muslims sitting and standing throughout the auditorium. The armed police and security guards nervously scanned the hall, their heads continually turning from side to side. It was a tense, highly theatrical scene, and it was such an about face from the informal dinner of less than 30 minutes before that I actually began to wonder, idiotically, which Malcolm was more real. I wondered if he perceived himself as playing a role. Then he went on to talk about his disgust with the preachers of nonviolence. He singled out Dr. King and others and accused them of misleading Negro America, of being leeches and 20th century Uncle Toms, charlatans who spoke only for a minority of Negroes and who sought to make their people permanent slaves to the white man's ego. I was shocked by the overt harshness of his attack, but his strong words captured my attention, as if the words themselves had picked me up by the scruff of the neck and shaken me. I was being forced to listen. I am not a theorist of nonviolence, he said. I believe that there comes a point when you fight fire with fire, and we're at that point. The only way Negroes can survive with any dignity is if we stand prepared to fight back. We cannot wait for the white man to change. He has proven he will not change. I cannot condemn white men who refuse to hire Negroes because I believe Negroes should finance their own businesses and hire their own kind of people. The Negro is sleeping, socially, morally, and economically. We must be taught to wake up and see what time it is. Muslims are against welfare programs because they lead to laziness and dependence of Negroes. Our members are taught to stand out on their own 2 feet. He said the Negroes do not want integration, they want complete separatism. The only property Negro owned in this country are their churches. We have failed to invest in job-producing industry that produce and to participate in the economic life of the nation. I can promise you that our divorce will result in a property settlement. Moses led the Jewish slaves out of Egypt, but they carried with them a lot of Egyptian gold and silver. He said his group, the Muslim faith, chose the Muslim faith because it is the only religion not based on race. Many in the audience booed when he said, you have to be white to be a good Christian. I remember that when I told the white supporters of my group that I was bringing Malcolm, they said, well, we're going to resign from the board. And if you don't bring somebody to give the other side. And so I called Malcolm back and I said, they want me to get somebody to present the other side. He said, well, all right, I'll debate Dr. King. Wow. So I called Atlanta and I talked with somebody at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And they said, well, Dr. King's not available to debate Malcolm X. We'll send Byron Rustin. Well, Byron Rustin has been working with A. Philip Randolph, and was a big leader of the movement. And I called Malcolm back and he said, well, I knew Dr. King wasn't going to debate me, but I'm not going to debate Byron Rustin. So he came nevertheless and spoke on his own. My supporters didn't quit, so things worked out.
Wow.
Two great men,
Awesome.
Malcolm X, Martin Luther King.
God rest him.
Different strategies, equal commitment and determination, equal sacrifice, and they paid equally with their lives.
Yeah, wow.
I left Massachusetts and I went to California after finishing law school up in New Haven. And I got out to Berkeley. And I just want to tell this story briefly because I think it illustrates part of my message, which is this. Those black people who get into office, or anybody who wants to be a leader, agent for change, has to recognize that you cannot make a difference if you're determined to stay where you are or keep your position. If you're not prepared to lose your position, to give up and go on, then you have to make compromises which blunt your ability to make a difference. I went out to Berkeley and I started practicing law in San Francisco. And in 1971, I ran for the city council and was elected Berkeley, California City Council. Berkeley was 25% black, and we were elected citywide. And I managed to get elected because some nice, generous white couple gave me some money because they liked me. And I used that money to run for office. And so when I got elected, I was from the South. See, there's something about being from the South that you just can't shake, you know? And so when I announced that I was running for the city council in Berkeley, I said, my first priority is going to be to the interest of the black community. And I don't think people were really paying any attention to that because you're not supposed to say something like that in California. Because there's the belief that everything is equal. You don't talk race, you know? And I got elected, and they accused me of being a carpetbagger because I'd only lived in Berkeley 3 months before the election. I moved here from an adjacent city, and you had to be there 3 months to qualify. And I got to the city manager's office. I had never been to city council meeting until I walked in as councilman-elect. But I noticed at the city manager's office, 13 staff people, all white, in Berkeley. Police department, 95% white. Fire department, 95% white. Berkeley, California. And so my pledge to fight for the interests of the black community meant I had to do something out there. And so they would have the council meetings and I'd get filibuster. One good thing about being a lawyer, we need more lawyers in public office. We don't have enough lawyers that continue to sacrifice getting these positions because as lawyers you're trained to know how to gum up the works.